Let me start with a simple observation. Every society that genuinely attempts a deep, disruptive reform eventually runs into the same paradox. The more necessary the reform is, and the more complex it becomes, the more aggressively it is misunderstood by those least equipped to understand it. And no, this is not a communication problem. It's not about explaining things better. It is a structural collision between systemic complexity and cognitive limitation. A textbook example of this can be found in post-Yugoslav societies when we talk about dismantling unreformed security and intelligence structures inherited from socialism, most notably the legacy of UDBA. Now, the objective of this reform is conceptually demanding, but strategically very simple. Remove informal centers of power that operate outside democratic control so that rule of law can function, markets can breathe, and integration into the European Union and NATO becomes credible rather than ceremonial. That's it. Yet the public debate almost never happens at this level, because in reality, this reform has nothing to do with ideology, nothing to do with revenge, nothing to do with rewriting history. It is about systems. It is about separating intelligence services from political parties and private business interests. It is about ending informal veto power over courts, prosecutors, regulators, and media. It is about replacing loyalty-based kadrovska politika with merit, accountability, and predictable rules. These changes are boring. They are invisible in the short term, but they are decisive in the long run. Investors care about them. Courts depend on them. Markets do not function without them. Now, here comes the problem. Systemic logic requires abstract thinking. It requires delayed gratification. It requires understanding causal chains that are not immediately visible. Large segments of the public simply do not operate at that level. So when they are confronted with complexity, they cannot process. They do the only thing they can do. They compress it down to something emotionally manageable. What emerges is not analysis. It is narrative substitution. Institutional capture becomes an attack on the state. Ending impunity becomes persecution of patriots. Aligning governance with EU benchmarks becomes foreign services taking over. The language of incentives, risk, and governance disappears completely. In its place, we get tribal symbolism, fear, and identity panic. Complexity is not debated. It is neutralized through caricature. And this process is not accidental. It follows a very predictable mechanism. First, there is a capacity gap. Reforms designed for institutional systems are received by audiences shaped by personal loyalty, informal networks, and zero-sum thinking. Then comes narrative replacement. Because the real explanation is too demanding, it gets overwritten by conspiracy, moral panic, or nationalist myth. And finally, collective reinforcement kicks in. Simplified slogans are amplified by captured media, opportunistic politicians, and echo chambers, until intellectual reduction starts being referred to as common sense. At that point, something fatal happens. The logic flips. The removal of shadow power structures is framed as chaos. Their continued existence is presented as stability. The loss of informal privilege is equated with the collapse of the state. Rule-based governance is portrayed as a loss of sovereignty. These are not ideological positions. They are symptoms of cognitive limitation. Because understanding that informal power produces permanent instability disguised as order requires systemic reasoning, and that is precisely what is missing. Post-Yugoslav societies are especially vulnerable to this dynamic because unreformed systems actively select for intellectual shallowness. Obedience is rewarded more reliably than competence. Narrative loyalty matters more than analytical skill. Over time, this creates a public sphere with low institutional literacy and high emotional volatility. So when reform finally appears, it is not experienced as progress. It is experienced as an existential threat. And here lies the real tragedy. The social groups most aggressively mobilized against reform are often the ones who would benefit from it the most. They defend structures that keep institutions weak, markets distorted, and opportunities scarce. They fight reformers instead of the mechanisms that quietly extract value from their lives. And every serious proposal gets reduced to the same primitive question: who is behind this? Never. How does this improve institutional performance? Never. What happens if we don't change? So let's be clear. This is not a story about disagreement. It is a story about asymmetry. When a complex, system-level reform meets a low-capacity collective mindset, the outcome is not debate. It is distortion. Reform becomes myth, governance becomes identity, and societies remain trapped, not because solutions are unavailable, but because understanding them exceeds the cognitive ceiling of those shouting the loudest. That is how necessary change is neutralized, not by argument, not by evidence, but by reduction. Thank you for over 5,000 visits in the last few days. I understand that we hit the central nerve of repression, and News will meet your expectations.